June 18, 1954. As dawn broke over the country of Guatemala, a plane suddenly swooped over the sleeping capital, Guatemala City. As it passed over the National Palace, the plane dropped thousands of pamphlets into the air. Confused citizens and police officers began to pick them up, and what they read was ominous. If Guatemala's president, Jacobo Arbenz, didn't resign by the afternoon, that same plane would return to bomb the city and the National Palace. Signed by the National Liberation Forces. A few hours later, President Arbenz heard the news. A plane had just attacked one of Guatemala's port cities, and an army of insurgents had crossed into Guatemala. Their banner read God, Fatherland, and Liberty. Arbenz's greatest fear had come true. The invasion had begun, and they were coming for his head. June 27, 1954. After 9 days of bombings, guerrilla fights, and psychological warfare, President Arbenz got his final ultimatum: surrender or death. He was surrounded by an invading army without any military support of his own, and he knew he was finished. At around 9 p.m., he addressed the nation over radio, and the second democratically elected president of Guatemala stepped down from his position and went into exile.
La verdad hay que buscarla en los intereses financieros de la compañía frutera y en los de los otros monopolios norteamericanos que han invertido grandes capitales en América Latina.
On paper, the downfall of Guatemala looked like just some trouble in a faraway country that no one cares about. But in reality, it was a coup orchestrated by none other than the CIA. That part is not very surprising. The shocking part is how a US fruit company lobbied the US government to overthrow the Guatemalan government because they were threatening the US fruit company's profits. Yes, a fruit company helped overthrow a sovereign government to protect their bottom line. After the invasion, Guatemala fell back into the hands of a brutal military regime. And for the following decades, terror, poverty, and assassinations dominated the country, all with the blessing of the CIA and the United Fruit Company. My name is Jake Tran. I make documentaries on money, power, war, and crime with my team. Subscribe for more. If you want to win $1,000 cash, all you have to do is follow me on Instagram at Jake Tran and you're automatically entered. Watch out for fake accounts. I would never message you asking for money or to invest. And this is how the US stole Guatemala. Right now, everyone is struggling to save money, especially with the super high gas prices and inflation. And one of the easiest ways to save money is by canceling subscriptions that you no longer use. That sounds great and all, but if you're like me, you have too many subscriptions to keep track of. But that is where Truebill comes in. Truebill is an all-in-one personal finance app that has saved me and 2 million other users a lot of money. We're talking over $100 million saved and counting. Check this out. All you have to do is link your bank account, Truebill will analyze and list out all the subscriptions you have and how much they're costing you, and then you can cancel the ones you don't need without ever leaving the Truebill app. It saves you money, time, and the hassle of dealing with an annoying cancellation process. It's my favorite feature of Truebill by far, and I use it all the time because I have way too many subscriptions to keep track of. My other favorite feature is how Truebill would negotiate your bills down for you. Super cool. Just select the bill you want to lower, take a picture of your bill, or enter your information manually, and Truebill will get to work right away, negotiating your bill down for you. Truebill has an 85% success rate in lowering bills, and if they're successful, you get to choose how much of those savings you want to pay to Truebill for their services. I usually choose 50% of whatever they save me. And there are a ton of other great features that I'm proud to promote, like tracking your credit score, net worth, or even setting up an automatic savings fund that you can withdraw from anytime. All you have to do to get started is pause the video and go to truebill.com/Jake with the link below. That's truebill.com/Jake with the link below so they know I sent you. Thanks to Truebill for sponsoring this video.
In May 1944, Guatemala's dictator General Ubico was facing a serious problem. He had been oppressing Guatemala's poor citizens for over a decade, but it seemed like people finally had enough of the corrupt military regime. They wanted a government that worked for the people, instead of just lining their own pockets. So Guatemala's citizens took matters into their own hands and began to demonstrate. They wanted Ubico out. And what does a dictator do when people start to oppose him? He puts his military to use. As people gathered in the main square, demanding that the dictator must go, he gave his military a clear order. Show these pesky protesters what happens when you stand up to the government. Then all hell broke loose. The military began to shoot into the crowd as if they were fighting off an invading army, and around 200 people were killed or injured. But this ruthless act of violence only strengthened the people's will, and they kept coming for him. And on July 1st, stunned by the opposition to his rule, Ubico resigned as president and turned over power to his general, Federico Ponce. But people quickly realized that he was just another tyrant with a different name. Nothing had changed. After a few months passed, one of Guatemala's best journalists had decided that he had seen enough. So he launched a series of bold articles and fiery speeches, criticizing the corrupt regime from all sides. Not surprisingly, a few days later, he was found dead, assassinated on government orders. The Guatemalans were outraged. Under rising pressure from the public, General Ponce agreed to hold a free election, and people immediately began to look for the right candidate to run against him. They needed someone who could put the country on the right path, and they soon found their ideal candidate, Dr. Jose Arevalo, a teacher who had been living in exile in Argentina for 14 years. His books and political vision were well known and respected throughout Guatemala, and he quickly became the nation's last hope, the man who might finally put an end to corruption and poverty in their country. When he arrived in Guatemala, he was welcomed like a hero, but it didn't last long. General Ponce heard about the euphoria and sent his military to arrest him, so Arevalo immediately had to go into hiding. But while the general was trying to get rid of his main competitor, his own fate was being sealed by two young officers, one of which would later become the president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz. He had fled Guatemala months earlier to plan a revolt, and now it was time to chase the corrupt government out of the country. The two officers gave weapons to supporters of the revolution and launched guerrilla attacks against police stations. And after a few days of fighting, General Ponce accepted a deal with the rebels. Guatemala's first free election would soon take place. There would be no corruption, no violence, no bribes. After a landslide victory, the general was sent packing home, and the people's candidate, Dr. Jose Arevalo, became the first elected president of Guatemala, and he immediately went to work. Guatemala's citizens got more rights, censorship was forbidden, and racial discrimination was made a crime. But the biggest challenge was the devastating poverty of the country. Guatemala's people relied heavily on agriculture for their survival. The problem was that about 2% of landowners owned more than 70% of the land, and much of it was uncultivated. So while a few wealthy landowners were living in luxury, 99% of the people were starving. Lifting Guatemala out of poverty would require an all-out attack on land ownership. But the problem was, most of this land wasn't owned by wealthy Guatemalans. No. That land was owned by one of America's most powerful companies. And luckily for that company, attacking private land ownership sounded a lot like communism, something that America was vehemently fighting against. After President Arevalo had served his term, Jacobo Arbenz became Guatemala's second elected president, the man who helped win the revolution.
In 1950, Jacobo Arbenz was voted president. He wasn't a communist, but some of his close allies were. A former military man, Arbenz sought to modernize Guatemala's backward society.
And the critical issue of land reform now laid in his hands. And he wasted no time going to war with the American company that owned the most land in Guatemala, the United Fruit Company. While most of Guatemala's people were struggling to survive, the United Fruit Company owned 500,000 acres of land, the railroads, and the port. Any business that wanted to export goods had to use their infrastructure, so they had nearly total control over the country's trade. The fruit company was also in the habit of forming close ties with corrupt dictators to get special deals. They bribed politicians, pressured the government, and intimidated opponents to get their way, while ruthlessly exploiting the country and its people. But their new president, Jacobo Arbenz, was about to shake the status quo. In October 1951, a top executive of the fruit company arrived in Guatemala from Boston to negotiate a new deal. He talked to President Arbenz as if he was his assistant and demanded the best terms for his company. The message was clear. You may be the president, but we, the United Fruit Company, are who really run this country, and you better do as we say. But President Arbenz was having none of it. He made him a different offer. Improve the docks, reduce the freight rates, and start paying more taxes. Shocked at these wild demands, the executive hurried back to Boston. For the fruit company, it was a declaration of war. In March 1953, the United Fruit Company's worst fears came into fruition. President Arbenz started the long-awaited land reform. He seized over 200,000 acres of uncultivated fruit company land and distributed it amongst the peasants. Based on the tax value of the land, Arbenz was willing to pay the fruit company about $630,000 in bonds. The fruit company's response? A formal complaint. But not by the United Fruit Company, but the U.S. State Department. They found the offer offensive and demanded $16 million. Yes, this fruit company was so powerful that the U.S. State Department was negotiating on their behalf. That's how big they were. But President Arbenz wasn't in the mood for concessions, and only a few months later, he seized even more United Fruit land. Now the company's executives in Boston start to get nervous. How dare he threaten our profits? United Fruit executives began to discuss the issue with their connections in Washington, and they all came to the same conclusion. President Arbenz was a threat to U.S. profits, freedom. We have to prevent communism from spreading, and not before long, a conclusion was reached in the U.S. government. President Arbenz must go. But even though we're talking about the all-powerful United States, they couldn't just send a few thousand U.S. Marines to invade the country. Sure, the invasion would be over in a few hours, but it would be a PR nightmare, an act of war, a violation of international law. So if the US wanted to dispose of the Guatemalan president, they had to be more strategic about it. If you want to overthrow a foreign government, you must first bring the people behind you. You need to make sure that everyone sees Guatemala as the enemy, a threat to America, a threat to everyone's freedom. And how do you do that? With a propaganda campaign against President Arbenz.
In Guatemala, the Jacob Arbenz regime became increasingly communistic after its inauguration in 1951. Communists in the Congress and high governmental positions controlled major committees, labor and farm groups, and propaganda facilities. They agitated and led in demonstrations against neighboring countries and the United States.
Convincing the public and the US president to overthrow a foreign government takes a true marketing genius. Someone who knows how to manipulate the masses and doesn't shy away from using dirty tricks. And who would be better suited for that task than the man who got American women to smoke? A man named Edward Bernays. In the 1920s, smoking was a big taboo for women. But thanks to Bernays' propaganda and marketing skills, he got women to smoke all over the country. He basically doubled the tobacco industry's revenue overnight. It was such a huge success that it turned him into an undisputed marketing legend. And now, it was time for Bernays' next big coup, a PR campaign to justify an invasion of Guatemala. And he brought out the big guns right from the start. He warned that dozens of communists had snuck into Arbenz's regime, secretly controlling his every move. He claimed that Arbenz was a puppet of the Soviet Union, and that a complete Soviet takeover was about to happen. He painted a picture of communism spreading all over America like a virus, and that everyone's freedom was at stake, all because of Guatemala. Bernays dominated the PR war in a brutal fashion, and Guatemala, they simply watched in fear while not being able to do anything to present their side of the story. But Bernays wasn't the only PR weapon of the United Fruit Company. In 1953, they began writing a confidential newsletter on Guatemala's politics and economy, and they wrote themselves into a frenzy. United Fruit paid $35,000 for a report that was sent to members of the US Congress and hundreds of Washington's decision makers. It was full of wild claims and theories that the Soviet Union was taking over Guatemala, and that they had to strike now before communism would conquer the entire American continent. These reports soon found their way to the highest ranks of the CIA. And thanks to the ties between the US State Department, the CIA, and the United Fruit Company, it didn't take long to get the green light for their mission.
Secretary of State Dulles takes the rostrum to urge united action by the Americas to outlaw international communist intervention in the Western Hemisphere.
This conference was shocked by the dastardly attack on members of the United States Congress by those who professed to be patriots. They may not themselves have been communists, but they had been subjected to the inflammatory influence of communism, which avowedly uses extreme nationalism as one of its tools.
Codename, Operation Success. Target, President Arbenz. Objective, get him out of the presidential palace, dead or alive. First, the CIA thought about killing Arbenz with a silent bullet, but they knew it could turn him into a martyr and cause a new revolution, so it was off the table. The next idea was to bribe Arbenz out of office. We're talking about a weak president in Central America after all. Of course he would accept money over death. So they transferred huge amounts of money into a Swiss bank account and told Arbenz that it was time to enjoy life. But unfortunately, they were dealing with a man of integrity, and he refused. Next, the CIA tried to sow division in his military. The US knew that Arbenz's survival was dependent on the loyalty of his men, and once they realized they were fighting for a lost cause, they would put down their weapons. But that plan also failed. His men were too loyal and unwilling to move against him at this point. With bribery no longer an option, the CIA recruited an army of mercenaries to infiltrate Guatemala and carry out guerrilla attacks. They set up training camps in Nicaragua, and about 150 men were trained in sabotage, demolition, and weapon training. The Liberation Army was born.
A CIA operation, codenamed PB Success, mobilized disaffected exiles and peasants into action.
Meanwhile, a special CIA unit planted Soviet-marked weapons inside Guatemala, ready to be quote-unquote discovered as proof that communism was taking over Central America, just in case you need to justify your actions in an international courtroom. The CIA also began to sneak planes into neighboring countries. The goal? A terror campaign to force Arbenz's army into submission.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II, and just rendered everybody paralyzed.
Now the CIA needed one more key actor, a Guatemalan exile who would lead the Liberation Army. But they couldn't just pick any bloodthirsty man. Once the invasion was over, the leading general would most likely take over the government. And the last thing the CIA wanted was another hothead who did what he wanted. The CIA needed someone they could control, a puppet who would work for US interests. And in Castillo Armas, a military commander, they found the perfect man for the job. Bloodthirsty, corrupt, and willing to serve American interests. Now all the CIA needed was the perfect excuse to set off the invasion. May 15th, 1954. Around 9 a.m., a cargo ship arrived in one of Guatemala's port cities. The cargo? Weapons worth over $1 million, straight from Czechoslovakia. It was Arbenz's desperate attempt to get ready for the invasion he knew was coming. But if he thought he could buy weapons undetected by the CIA, he was badly mistaken. The CIA knew about his interest in these weapons for over a year, but instead of spreading panic, the CIA was relieved. They had been trying to find a good excuse for a long time to unleash the Liberation Army. The CIA had already begun to plant weapons with Soviet markings inside Guatemala, but US critics may see through the trick. So the cargo ship full of Czech weapons was a gift sent from heaven. It was the final proof they needed. Guatemala was doing business with the communists. A day later, the CIA had a quick meeting to discuss the situation, and they all came to the same conclusion. Arbenz now had enough weapons to crush his neighbors and take over Central America. Even President Eisenhower warned that the arrival of Czech weapons in Guatemala might lead to a, quote, communist dictatorship on this continent to the detriment of all American nations, end quote. With the green light of the US president, the CIA set the invasion date for June 18th. June 18, 1954. After the Liberation Army demanded that Arbenz must resign, airstrikes in and around Guatemala City were launched. Fighter jets kept coming out of nowhere and even attacked a school, riddling it with machine gun fire. As the airstrikes continued, the CIA's puppet General Castillo Armas advanced into Guatemala with his troops. But things weren't going so well for the general. They failed to take over key cities, and Arbenz's army was able to push them back. To make things worse, one of the pilots had the task to bomb a radio station in Guatemala City. But the pilot attacked the wrong station, the one occupied by Americans. It was a total disaster. They were failing on almost all fronts. To prevent the mission from collapsing, the CIA had to act quick. They flat out told Eisenhower that they had to send more fighter jets, or Operation Success would fail. Under huge pressure to save the mission, the president gave the go-ahead. This time, CIA pilots picked their targets more carefully. They bombed military stations, oil reserves, and several key cities, while President Arbenz and his army were slowly pushed into a corner. Out of pure desperation, Guatemala's foreign minister sent a message to the US Secretary of State asking for support, but they just shrugged their shoulders and turned up the psychological warfare. At night, they played tapes of bombing attacks over large speakers to cause even more panic and fear. And just in case that wasn't enough, the CIA's propaganda radio spread fake news that Arbenz's army was defeated, and that General Castillo Armas was leading an army of 5,000 men. Even though he never had more than 400 men under his command, it was psychological warfare at its finest, and Guatemala was close to defeat. To make things worse, President Arbenz's army began to crack under the pressure. His commanders began accepting bribes, and one of his commanders allegedly surrendered his troops for $60,000. On June 25th, President Arbenz made one last desperate attempt. He wanted to hand out weapons to everyone who was willing to fight for him. But the next day, he heard the shocking news. No one was willing to go to war for him. Without an army or any support, the end was near. A few days into the invasion, the CIA decided that it was time for the final big lie. They spread the news that two large armies were on their way to surround Guatemala City. Fearing for their lives, people began to flee the city, and President Arbenz was now at the mercy of the United States. Shortly after, he got his final ultimatum. He had until 4 p.m. to leave the National Palace and turn over power. If he was still president by the end of the day, they would bomb him into the ground. Arbenz realized that if he refused to leave, it would only end up in more battles and the loss of many lives. So on June 27th at around 9 p.m., he addressed his people via radio for the last time. They have used the pretext of anti-communism. The truth is very different. The truth is to be found in the financial interests of the fruit company and the other US monopolies which have invested great amounts of money in Latin America. At around midnight, former President Arbenz walked down the steps of the National Palace one last time and went into exile. The coup was followed by some of the darkest times in Guatemalan history. Desperate and defeated, the former president first fled to Mexico. Restless and mostly unwelcomed, he moved with his wife and 3 children from country to country, including Switzerland, France, Russia, and Uruguay. Then, Fidel Castro invited him to live in Cuba, but Arbenz was too exhausted and depressed to fight in another revolution. he also had problems with his favorite daughter, Arabella. She had refused to follow him to Cuba, which already caused him great pain. But then, his darkest nightmare came true. During an evening out in Bogota in Colombia, she had an argument with her boyfriend. She was so furious that she walked right up to him, pulled out a gun, and shot herself in front of him. She was only 25 years old. During the funeral, Jacobo Arbenz leaned over his daughter's coffin and whispered, "I will be with you soon, my little daughter." On January 27, 1971, Arbenz drowned in his bathtub at his Mexican home. Guatemala's fate was equally dark. Right after the invasion, General Castillo Armas became Guatemala's new president. He reversed the land reform, and most citizens suffered great poverty once again. But his reign was short-lived. One evening in July 1957, he went out to have dinner with his wife. Out of nowhere, a stranger showed up and shot him several times. He collapsed and died within seconds, but it didn't make things better for the poor country. One corrupt regime after the other took over, and terror, poverty, and political assassinations dominated the country. Death squads sponsored by the military regime roamed the country freely. People were kidnapped or killed in the streets on a daily basis. Anyone who protested, anyone who dared to challenge the military regime suffered the same fate: torture and inevitable death. In the decade after 1966, tens of thousands of people were kidnapped, tortured, and killed, all with the blessing of the US and the CIA. What the CIA doesn't like to admit is that the invasion of Guatemala almost failed, which is kinda embarrassing since we're talking about the US versus a small country in Central America. But in 2011, one US mission was a huge success: the raid on Osama bin Laden. After the SEALs had assassinated bin Laden, they discovered something drastic in his compound: a treasure trove of computers, hard drives, notebooks, and printed files lying around on every floor. These files could contain priceless intelligence. It took the SEALs an extra 18 minutes to collect this treasure trove of 500,000 digital and physical files. This intel collection would become known as the Bin Laden Papers. For years, most of those files were kept classified. But in 2017, the CIA finally declassified over 470,000 of those files for the world to see. And what they contained was shocking, to say the least. But here's the thing. A video that goes this deep into bin Laden's life, his attacks, and his plans for the world is guaranteed to get demonetized. So that's why we just released a brand new private documentary going over the Bin Laden Papers in all its infamy. The video has already been age restricted, and channel members have been loving the documentary. All you have to do to get access to this documentary right now, and all the other documentary length videos that are too controversial, too dark, too risky to post publicly, is to click the join button below. Once you sign up, you'll get exclusive access to the Bin Laden Papers, plus others like Jeffrey Epstein, Monsanto, the company that owns the world's food supply, MK Ultra, and many more in the future. These are the things they should be teaching you in university about how the world works. But unlike university, you get all of this for just $5 a month. And what's even better is that if you join and you don't think it's worth it, email me and I'll personally refund you the money for the last month you paid. Pause the video and click that join button below right now.
I don't know about you guys, but I find these CIA intervention videos super fascinating. So if you have any ideas on what other crazy CIA stories we should do next, let me know in the comments below. If you're new here, my name is Jake, and this is one of the biggest channels on YouTube for documentaries on money, power, war, and crime. So if you enjoyed this video, we make multiple documentaries just like this one for free every single week. So click that subscribe button below. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram for a chance to win $1,000. At Jake Tran, watch out for fake accounts. But that's gonna wrap it up. Stay dangerous out there, and I will see you guys in the next one.